Yeah, that would be a very good idea. Save it.
Go ahead.
Um, so anyway, around that period in time, I just sort of made a conscious decision. I think honestly, somewhat akin to what you felt around the same time. Like obviously, I have this prodigious ability as a well, not first person shooter, but a RTS player. You were saying I have this amazing ability as an RTS player. I finished third in the world. Like I'm clearly meant to do this, and I'm very good at it. But at a certain point, duty calls. I need to get serious about my life, and I need to explore the things because maybe I'm missing out on something really, really important. And it just so happens that the Diablo thing came along at that period in time. So I was able to go and devote myself to that, and relatively quickly began to pursue it as a business venture because the secondary market was growing up. It was in its infancy, but it was growing up in the context of that game. Diablo 2 was one of the very first games that people really started to take seriously to the point where they wanted to spend large amounts of disposable income on it. And it seems quaint by modern day where you've got people spending $15,000, $20,000 a month on games like Clash of Clans or Candy Crush and stuff, these crazy addicts. Back then, it was totally unheard of, though, that people would pay $100 for an item. And so I was farming and finding items to sell in Diablo out of my little tiny cottage that I was living in Davis. But the reason why it matters so fundamentally is because it was through my playing Diablo that I forged my friendship with the person who would later become one of my absolute best friends and business partner, co-founder of Grimy Gear Games development studios in New Zealand, a guy named Chris Wilson. He and I met playing Diablo. We were both avid fans of the game. He was still going to high school, so he didn't have any business relationship to it at all. I was still doing stuff related to business, but we both had tremendous passion for the game. And just through our conversations that steadily evolved along with our friendship over the intervening 3 or 4 years, we started talking about how it seems like Blizzard is neglecting their curation of this game. They've kind of got Diablo to a point where they're happy with its balance and they're happy with its content. And now they clearly have their set sight on other projects, and they're really kind of neglecting the Diablo mantle. And we haven't heard anything about a successor to this game. And there have been a few third-party groups of people who had actually created their own content to add to Diablo 2. There's a second expansion to it. The name doesn't immediately come to mind, but there's actually a third-party made secondary expansion to Diablo 2. Obviously you can't play it on Blizzard's closed servers. You can only play it on the effectively open BattleNet. But an entire fan-made expansion was created. But other than that, the game was just totally neglected. And so we had a serious conversation about well, maybe we have the opportunity here to go and try to make our own version of this, because we're all avid gamers. We're at a period in our lives right now where we have enough stability that we might be able to go and devote ourselves, in the form of sweat equity, basically, devote ourselves for 2 to 3 years on a game development project, and maybe we can actually make something happen, provided that we can get other people of similar passion involved. And so to that end, Chris brought on board his very good friend from university, who was a couple years younger, a guy named Jonathan Rogers, who was absolutely prodigious genius when it came to programming. And Jonathan actually had the capability to write an entire game engine from scratch, which gave us a huge evolutionary advantage as a company, because most of the time, if you're a fledgling game development studio and you want to go and make a game, well, you have to license an engine to build that game in. Even if you have the best idea, you need the actual framework, you need the tools, which is what that engine is, to create the game world. And you can add a lot, right, through art and music and design to that framework, to those tools, but the tools themselves are so fundamental to actually making the game work and to make it playable and modern that they're often indispensable for most game development companies. They have to start with an engine developed by a third party. And the problem with that is, of course, is that the engines aren't cheap. They usually require a initial fee as well as a secondary, it's almost like a royalty payment. You have to pay a percentage of your total revenue to the company that owns the game engine. The most common example of this is the game engine called the Unreal game engine.
Unreal,
which is, the Unreal Engine, which is an incredibly powerful, amazing engine to build games with. But the problem is, and I don't know the exact percentages. But the problem is if you build your game with the Unreal Engine, for all time, in perpetuity after that point, every dollar that you make, a portion of it goes to the guys that made the Unreal Engine. You have to pay. So, and it scales forever. There's no cap on it. So if you make a game that has $1 billion in annual revenue, you might have to give $200 million a year to the guys that made the engine that your game was built in. It scales indefinitely.
Sounds like a great business model.
Oh, and it's obviously a great business model for them. But conversely, the Unreal Engine is incredible. It allows indie developers, if they're willing to sort of take the plunge, it allows them to build a game world that they would never in a million years be able to build otherwise, because the tools themselves are so sophisticated, and they're constantly updating the Unreal Engine to make it better and better and better. So we had to make a choice about whether or not we wanted to build our game in an established engine or go out on our own. And because Jonathan was involved in the project, Jonathan was able to devote a year and a half or whatever, as long as it took him, to build our entire engine from scratch. So we were able to completely circumvent that conundrum at the very beginning. And then our fourth co-founder was another person that Chris and I also knew from the Diablo world, incidentally, a guy living in Sweden named Eric Olofsson, who just so happened to be finishing up his, I guess, graduate work in graphic design school, and was kind of a free agent and looking for something to do. And he was willing to move to emigrate from Sweden all the way out to New Zealand and become a New Zealand citizen in order to become our art/creative director. So we had this 4 people involved from the very beginning, and we started out in Chris's garage, literally his garage, in a suburb in this place called New Lynn, which is about 7-8 miles south of Auckland, the biggest, it's not the capital of New Zealand, but the biggest city in New Zealand, in this little suburb in Chris's garage. And we had our whiteboard and our ideas, and we just set to work on making the game. And it was a very, very lengthy process that involved making a million mistakes and operating on all sorts of countless wrong assumptions, but steadily figuring things out over the span of roughly 5 intervening years. Designing the engine, hiring a few employees, just doing crazy amounts of overall game design, trying tons of ideas, streamlining the game concept, coming up with some really revolutionary ideas that are still preserved in the game to this day. And I want to say it was 2011. By 2011, we had reached a point in our development where we had to bring in additional investment. We had kind of burned through our entire runway. Chris and I were basically at this point in our lives where we had to decide whether or not we were going to mortgage our houses to continue to fund the development of the game, or whether or not we were going to just have to, I don't know, release it unfinished or something. But we did this thing where we, at kind of the behest of the public, because we had the game playable in what was called a closed alpha. So there were people that could basically, a very small subset of people could log in and play a version of the game, but the public had never seen it at large. There had been a few articles written about it, but really nothing in a broader sphere. And then we decided, at the encouragement of the public, to hold an open beta weekend. So we, for the very first time, we kind of opened the floodgates, and we let anybody that wanted to play the game log in for the first time to play it. This was, I want to say it was like late March or early April of 2012. And yeah, it was definitely 2012. And we were super nervous about doing this because at the time we felt like the game was still, like I certainly felt like the game was still in a really rudimentary state. And I was really worried because, like anything, right, you only get one chance to make a first impression. And if people flood into the game and they're like, this game's horrible, what the hell are you guys doing here? We're done, right? There's almost no getting past that because the narrative is going to be overwhelmingly negative going forward. It's just like launching a game that's not finished and your Metacritic reviews are all negative. You're screwed, basically. It's so hard to recover from that.
Yeah.
And so it was a huge risk to do it. And to our delight and tremendous surprise, the perception of the public, the people who logged in, and there were thousands and thousands of people who tried it that weekend, was almost unanimously positive. People really, really liked it. They really liked a ton of things about it, even the things about it that we were quite critical of internally. They really liked it. And most importantly, what we heard over and over and over again is, not only do we love what you're doing, but we want to help support it. We want to help this game. We see the potential of it. This is the game that we've always wanted to play. And we want to help you take it over the finish line. And so in about a week, we slapped together our own sort of internal Kickstarter style campaign, our own crowdfunding campaign that we hosted on our own site. again, to avoid having to pay a whole bunch of money
Right.
to a third party like
Yeah, yeah,
Kickstarter. And we were able to raise, I think in the first week, we raised $250,000, which was just mind blowing. And then we continued our crowdfunding for about a period of a full year, and we raised over $2 million more to
wow.
develop the game in that span. And that allowed us, getting back to what I was saying before about how these broad, ambitious projects burn through all the runway early and then have to release something that's a shell of what they promised. That really allowed us to take the game to its natural conclusion. And so the version of Path of Exile that we finally released in October of 2013 was really good and really playable. It had its fair share of bugs. It had some fundamentally mechanical problems. One of the biggest problems of all had to do with latency, which of course you're very familiar with as an RTS player, right? But
You have that
but the
selection.
solution to latency in a game like StarCraft, of course, is that if somebody starts to lag, the whole game lags until that person resyncs, right? And maybe is there a period of time if they're disconnected for too long, they just get dropped, right? And then the game resumes without them.
Yeah, by the time we're competing, we're on LAN. So
Right, you're on the LAN. I'm talking about playing like on BattleNet.
yeah, yeah. So BattleNet, like during the ladder, if you disconnect, it became disconnects a loss because there were too many abusers. And then, yeah, during competition, if the qualifications were online, they would try to reconnect it. In fact, one of my games did disconnect, and even though disconnect is loss in the
Right.
rules, they want to finish the tournament. They don't want to
Right, of
disconnect.
course, they can't just have that happen if it happens randomly in the tournament.
So yeah, they make every effort to reconnect.
So there's two basic ways that a game like Path of Exile or Diablo can be presented to the player, and the way that you can mechanically have the player interact, the client interact with the server. There's what's called lockstep mode, and there's predictive mode. And lockstep mode is what exists in StarCraft. It's basically the idea that if I click on my screen to have my siege tank go over here and go into siege mode, that action won't happen until the packet gets to the server, tells you what's going to happen, and the server sends it back to the player. Your tank is going to move here and sit down. And if you see your tank go over and on this point on the screen, you know it's there. You know it's there on the server while it's on your screen at the same time. You know that you're sieging on the bluff, and you didn't in fact wander down the ramp and walk your siege tank into his base. Like, you know that's what you're seeing is actually what's happening. And that's called, basically, it's known as lockstep mode, at least in our game. Conversely, you have what's called predictive mode, which is how Diablo 2 was designed. And that's how Path of Exile was designed as well. And predictive mode is that basically there's this kind of interplay going on between the client and the server, where the client sends a packet to the server, and immediately on their screen, whatever action they executed, they'll see it happen in real time. So they'll see their guy, they click up above to go run into another room, they'll see their guy run up into the room on their screen. But on the server, that action is actually not going to happen until the packet telling the server that they moved into the room gets to the server, gets processed, and then sent back to the client. And what happens a lot of the time is that those two actions can be out of sync. On the player's screen, they're moving into the other room, but because of lag, it may not actually get processed on the server itself. The server might think, okay, well, let's say it takes like a full second to get to the server to get processed. Well, in that time, 3 monsters come down and they get in the way of the doorway. So the player sees himself run up into the next room where there's 3 monsters. But on the server, it doesn't get that command for another second. And in that span, the monsters walk into the doorway and block it. So on the server, the player who thinks he's run into the other room is in fact stuck in the first room with 3 monsters in front of him that are beating on him that he can't see.
Okay.
And the player is like running around, swinging and trying to do things. And all of a sudden he notices, wait a minute, I'm swinging my sword and it's not doing anything. I'm not seeing the monsters fall over. Oh shit, what just happened? I'm desynced. At which point they start seeing themselves taking damage and there's no monsters on the screen because that's what's happening on the server.
Right.
And unless a resyncing event happens that gets the two things to slam together all of a sudden, where the player would suddenly rubber band and jump back into the room and now, oh shit, I'm behind 3 monsters that are killing me. I better heal myself and kill them. If that event doesn't happen fast enough, you just die because you don't know what the hell's even happening. The problem was that when we built Path of Exile starting in 2006 and when Jonathan wrote its engine and so on, we were dealing with a version of the internet that had a lot of dial-up and was just generally a lot slower. New Zealand in particular had a really, really glacial internet. They did not have fiber optics and stuff back in that period of time. It was much, much slower. And so there was no way for us to do the lockstep mode that StarCraft uses, because while it does work for an RTS, in the context of a fast action-paced action RPG, if you try to make it lockstep mode, you're constantly sticking. Your guy's running and then stopping for 30, 40, 50, 100 milliseconds, and then moving again and stopping and moving again and stopping. You just feel like you're in molasses. It's a really, really bad play experience that really makes the game feel terrible. And so we had to go and make our first version of Path of Exile fully predictive mode, which made it felt like it played really fluidly, but people were constantly dealing with this desynchronization problem. It was a disaster. And it really, really was, it was a problem to the point where so much of the early game's narrative was like, Path of Exile is awesome, but good luck playing it. You're just going to be dying constantly to desync and you're going to have a terrible time. That was sort of the meme that just propagated throughout the early narrative of the game. But despite that, we still got a lot of really, really good critical reviews. We actually, the big sort of seminal moment after the game's release was, I think a little bit later, either at the beginning, I think it was early in 2014, one of the biggest online gaming magazines, publications, a company called GameSpot, did they do a year in review and they award awards to different categories. And then they have the biggest broad award, that's sort of the equivalent of the Oscar for Best Picture, which is PC Game of the Year. They award that to one lucky title. And we were utterly astonished to find, when they were announcing their candidates, that Path of Exile was a candidate for PC Game of the Year for 2013 in GameSpot.
Sick.
Which was unbelievable. That's alongside AAA titles from major companies, companies that had spent over $100 million developing their games. And we were being mentioned in the same breath as them. Obviously, we didn't expect to win, but it was unbelievable to just be mentioned. And this goes on for a couple of weeks, and they announce the winner, and our game is the fucking winner. We win the Game of the Year in GameSpot for 2013. So obviously, we had done a lot of things right. And it took us a long time to really figure out how to properly monetize the game. That was one of the biggest things to overcome. Another thing was figuring out how to release content in a way that kept players engaged, without boring them, that allowed them to come back. And this is something actually where we borrowed a ton of lessons from Wizards of the Coast, in terms of the way that they figured out how to release their content in the cycles that they use. And I'll direct your viewers, and you by extension, to what I consider to be mandatory required viewing for anybody in the world who's interested in game development, really anybody who's interested in a business per se, that directly interacts with the public. Let me find the name of the title for you here, so I don't misquote it. All right.
I had no idea, because like I just go on Twitch and I see Path of Exile. I'm like, oh, that's Brian Weisman's game.
Yeah, man, we've been ranked as high as #1 on Twitch TV numerous times on release day and stuff. It's crazy. We've had hundreds of thousands of concurrent viewers and stuff. Okay, so the video. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, obviously, I don't mean any disrespect. I obviously have huge respect for you. I just because it's not my genre, so I wouldn't play.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, I mean, I wouldn't expect anything. Okay, so there's a bunch of different versions of this video. There's one officially released by GDC. Are you familiar with GDC?
I've been told to go, but I just don't have time and energy. But eventually, I will.
Okay. Yeah. Well, for people who don't know about it, GDC stands for, it's a very, very creative name. It stands for Game Developers Conference. Yeah. An annual conference, the biggest of its kind in the world, I believe, and it's held normally in San Francisco in February of every year. I don't think it was held this year for obvious reasons. It was canceled. Maybe it's been moved to March. But Chris Wilson, co-founder, lead designer, CEO of Grinding Your Games, obviously very, very good friend of mine, and one of the primary reasons why the game has become the success that it is. I think if you were to find any individual who the success owes most to, it's him for sure, for many different reasons. But Chris was invited to give a talk at GDC last year in 2019. The talk was titled "Designing Path of Exile to be Played Forever." That's the name of the title. So if you want to look it up on YouTube, it is phenomenal. It's 1 hour long. It is one of the best hours you will ever spend in terms of really learning the ins and outs of what can make particularly a gaming company succeed and what can make a game company fail, and the lessons that we learned in that entire process, starting in 2006 and really going all the way up to the present, all the way up to 2019. I mean, we're still certainly learning more things, but it's such a perfect kind of dissemination of all of these critical qualities of what can make a game company succeed, and particularly with regards to a game that's designed in the same way that ours is. And many games are designed this way nowadays. You know, back in the day when Diablo 2 came out, for example, the typical way that a game was designed was you spend all your money and time developing a release product, you sell it for $50, everybody buys it, you know, hopefully you sell millions of copies. You do a few small patches and fixes to it, then you release one big expansion to it, and then you move on to the next project. That tends to be how a lot of these games were done. Certainly Diablo was done that way.
StarCraft as
A game like, yeah, and StarCraft as well, exactly. Brood War, they never made a game after Brood War, did they? Brood War was it.
StarCraft 2, but like they just, this is
But
the pattern you said.
but under the mantle of StarCraft 1, they made
Yes.
StarCraft, the original game,
it.
right? What was it called? What was the original version of it called?
Wings of Liberty, I think.
Wings of Liberty, yeah. Or no, maybe that was StarCraft 2.
That's SR2.
I feel like it was. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Anyway, StarCraft 1, Brood War, which was objectively better than StarCraft, right? It was just a mass improvement. In the same way that Lord of Destruction was a big improvement on original Diablo. It added a ton of new cool stuff. And then they were done with it. They made a few little balance adjustments, but they pretty much moved on to developing other products and eventually StarCraft 2 many, many years later. And Diablo was exactly the same way. Path of Exile, conversely, we set out from the very beginning, we said, we want this to be at least a 10-year project. So we're going to release the game, we're going to give it away for free, and then we are going to keep people engaged and coming back at regular intervals for at least 10 years. That was the short-term goal. And of course, that was our stated mission statement 7 years ago. We're now 7 years in, and the game is bigger now than it ever has been. Quite a bit bigger. If you go back every year, the game was growing exponentially, starting in around 2016 all the way up until the present. But Chris's talk addresses that idea. It addresses that business model. And I think that a game like that is probably the easiest thing to develop, promote, and succeed with, because it's so easy to, it's so much easier to go start out with something that is good but imperfect, and then gradually improve it through subsequent iterations, releasing content in a regular cycle that keeps people coming back and engaged and seeing the incremental improvement, and then contrasting the release version of the game with the version that exists 5 years later and just being utterly astonished. Like, these games are barely even recognizable as being the same thing. And yet clearly this is the same game. It's just so much better now than it was when I set out playing it. And Magic has succeeded that way, in that has completely succeeded that way as well, right? I mean, you've seen contrast Richard Garfield's original alpha set with the way that Magic exists today. You know, Magic is objectively just so much better as a game. I know the old school players don't agree.
I've seen that. Let's get your, well, okay. Let's finish whatever, or the Path of Exile thing. And I do want to touch up on the old, like how Magic's viewed, and Magic versus Hearthstone, obviously. But yeah. Path of Exile. Let's talk about Path of Exile.
Okay, well, I mean, as far as, do you have any specific questions about it?
I just know it's the Diablo 2 genre, and I wanted to get, or me plus the audience would love to get like any inside scoop on just your adventures in general.
Yeah, I mean, as far as like the relatively short explanation, just sort of promoting what the game is, it's in the action RPG genre. So I would say that genre was certainly pioneered by the Diablo series. Diablo 2 being the best, most famous example of that. That was certainly the bar that we were shooting for with our game. We basically said that we felt that there were specific things about Diablo 2 that made it so compelling, fun, addictive, the kind of game that people would throw thousands and thousands of hours at, even when they had completely run out of things to do. There were people still just playing Diablo 2 all day, farming it, reading forums and stuff, working on builds and stuff, and hoping obviously that there would be more content to do. And of course, that hope was never recognized. But it had whatever it is, and tangible and intangible things, it kind of just had the secret recipe. It really, truly did. It had the perfect mixture of everything that made a game like that great. And so we really wanted to create a modern version of Diablo 2, but that preserved everything that made it great, but added many, many additional layers on top of that to make it a more long-term thing that you could enjoy. So some people have even gone so far as to calling Path of Exile an MMO, in the same vein as World of Warcraft, for example. And I don't think that the comparison is particularly fair, mainly because MMOs are built around the idea of cooperative gameplay. at the heart of every successful MMO, generally, there's cooperative gameplay. There's raiding. World of Warcraft, of course, is the best example of that, right? And World of Warcraft has been around for 16 years now. It's incredibly venerable title at this point. Still has, by any metric, is still insanely successful. In any game, if it had World of Warcraft's current base of players, would be totally satisfied and be considered a gigantic success, even though it's not as high as it used to be. But in World of Warcraft, everything you do is almost secondary to raiding for the most part. They've added other things for players to do who want to play alone. Certainly PvP is a component of it. But most people who play World of Warcraft long term are doing it as raiding, where you get 10 or 25 people together and you go and you do a big collective fighting a big boss, where everybody has a specifically defined role to play and everybody's an important kind of cog in a bigger machine. And Path of Exile is not like that. The game is really kind of designed to be played solo. You're allowed to party, and you certainly, there's some content that's easier while partying, but most people play Path of Exile as a solo endeavor. So I don't think the comparison is really that great. But it's a very sort of typical way that action RPGs unfold. You start as a crappy little level 1 character with no equipment and no skills, and you incrementally improve your character while you go through the game's storyline. And so you progress through the game storyline, which in the case of the current version of the game unfolds over 10 acts. So it starts in Act 1, you go to Act 2, Act 3, and so on. Every act is different. The story changes as you go. And by the time you reach Act 10 and you complete all the main game storyline, you generally have a fairly high level and usually quite effective, powerful character, at which point you enter the game's end game, which, due to our incremental improvements in the fact that we are constantly layering on new content, just like Magic expansions, once you get to the end game, there are tons of different things to do to keep you engaged in the end game. And we release new content in 3-month cycles as well. So even if you've played the game in the past, let's say you played Path of Exile when it released back in 2013, or you played in 2015 for a year or so and then drifted away from it, if you come back to the game now, it will be a very fresh and fun new experience. It will feel almost like a completely new game, which is kind of instrumental in keeping the players engaged. So we see, as far as player engagement, when you look at the release cycles, we can see the amount of people that are actually playing, and you get these huge spikes in activity and player engagement. And the concurrency levels for release days have gone up. I mean, they're gigantic. Over 200,000 people playing at any given time around when we release new expansion content and stuff. I think the record might be 218,000 concurrents. And that's just on the servers that include the United States and Europe. That doesn't include the Asia servers, which are their own thing, their own separate animal. So who knows how many people? I'm not privy to the numbers at all. But it's a lot of people certainly playing the game.
Sure.
And I remember last year, Steam, which is our game, you can download it from the pathofexile.com website, and it's totally for free.
Link below. There's a link below.
There's no strings attached. There's no gated content in the game. 100% of the game experience is accessible to people who spend no money at all. And everything that we sell in the game, they're under the banner of this, what we call ethical microtransactions. We made a very, very distinct point when we were promoting the game initially that unlike other games, certainly freemium games today, our game would be totally egalitarian in the sense that if you succeed at Path of Exile, you're doing it through your own guile, your own intelligence, your hard work, your acumen, your skill. You're not doing it because you have daddy's credit card and you can just go and buy all the best stuff. That's not something that we would ever promote. It's not something that was ever part of our business model. We never had any interest in doing that at all. Quite the opposite, in fact. We specifically wanted to define ourselves as being different from many other games in the genre that allow people to essentially pay to win.
Pay to win.
Right, exactly. So Path of Exile was very, very adamantly anti-pay to win. And to that end, what we sell, the way that the game is monetized, we sell primarily two things. We sell cosmetic upgrades to the game in the same way that League of Legends does. So you can get reskins on your heroes and stuff, exactly. So we have reskins on skills, on items, on item effects, on monsters. What else? The characters themselves. Really, really cool armor sets and stuff. Just tons of ways to make your character look cool. We sell little pets, which have no impact on gameplay, but that run alongside of you and look cool. We sell decorations for people's hideouts, which are basically little personal encampments that players make that they can decorate and customize for themselves, which allow them, meeting places for people to hang out at. And then we sell small quality of life upgrades, generally under the broader umbrella of more or better storage space. So when somebody makes an account in Path of Exile, they get a quite a generous stash space where they can stick all their items. And the stash space is shared between all the characters on the account. However, if you play the game a lot, if you play it avidly and you're not very careful with what you collect, you'll tend to fill up your stash space rather quickly.
Sure.
And you're left with two options. You can either make another account for free and use that as a temporary storage facility, which is what a lot of people do. And you can make unlimited amounts of those accounts. They're known as mule accounts. Or you can spend some money and buy extra storage space. And that way you've got it all consolidated on your main account. And if you buy some of that storage space, you can buy enhanced versions of that storage space. So you can buy storage space where that you can colorize the tabs and name them specific things. So kind of like an index, you can find the things you're looking for. There's a certain storage tab that only stores currency in the game. So when you find all the different types of currency items in the game, you have a special tab that can store huge amounts of currency and it keeps it nicely organized for you and so on. So those are the primary things. Those are basically what we sell in the game. And it's been totally successful as far as a business model. People have totally expressed their love for it. They've totally engaged with it. And we've been able to completely monetize the game that way through that without ever having to resort to the sort of cynical ways that a lot of companies wind up actually extracting money from their player bases.
So, we're going to bang right here. Because we've been competitive gamers, do you think that has an effect on our influence of we would like things to be more of a meritocracy than, say a pay-to-win model?
Totally. I mean, I think that sentiment pervades. I mean, obviously, take poker, for example, right? The amount of people who wish that poker was a meritocracy. The best example I can think of is Phil Hellmuth, right? Phil Hellmuth, the most famous person advocating for this idea, famously saying that if poker were a game of skill, pure skill, I would never lose, right? He's famous for saying that.
Yeah, I mean, I know Phil Hellmuth, and the older I get, the higher appreciation I have for him, because whatever people think of his shtick, his goal is to keep poker alive as an industry. Like that's his end goal. So whatever his methods, and he's shifted over the years. Like I had a podcast with him. Everyone said he was it was as authentic as possible with me.
Really?
Like compared to his other.
I mean, maybe he's changed. I've only had one encounter with the guy ever. It was in, I want to say like 2000. What was the year that Chris Ferguson won the World Series? 2002, 2001.
Chris Moneymaker's 2003.
Chris Ferguson.
In
the final.
2000 or 2001, I think. I'm not.
Moneymaker was 03. I think this was 2000.
Yeah.
I went there, and I was there actually with Matt Place. We both went to go watch the main event, and remember how it was in two stages? They would play at Binion's, like all the early rounds were at Binion's, and then they would move over and play their final round at, I don't remember where the finals were. Yeah. I don't think it was at Binion's, though. Maybe they were still doing it at Binion's then. I don't feel like it was.
I don't remember.
It's not important. Anyway, it was one of the early rounds, and Phil Hellmuth was actually playing, and I was a railbird. I was just watching the action from the side, and I was paying a lot of attention to it. And obviously, he doesn't know me from Adam. I'm just some random guy. But I knew enough about poker at that point that I could understand a lot of the basic strategy. I could certainly watch them play and kind of figure out what they were thinking and what they were trying to do. And they had a dinner break or a rest break or something, and Phil Hellmuth was downstairs talking to a couple of people. And I stood by the side. I was patiently waiting because I wanted to ask him about a specific hand or make a comment about a specific hand that he was in. And after he was done with the two guys, they kind of walked off, and he was just standing there. And I walked up and I introduced myself, and I said, I've read a lot about your poker exploits and stuff. And I saw this particular hand, and I was wondering if you could either explain to me what you're thinking, or I thought, I asked him a question, and he just looks at me. And he looks over my shoulder, and he just walks past me without saying a word. Just completely ignored me and blew me off completely. And I remember just standing there like utterly astonished, thinking, who the fuck does that? Like, I get, maybe you're in the zone, maybe you're hyper-focused on the task at hand. Maybe you feel you're running poorly or whatever. But like just the general level of just pure naked disrespect to just disregard me completely and pretend like I didn't even exist when I was asking this question. I was so disgusted, and it completely just colored how I felt about poker pros and poker celebrities going forward from that point onward. I thought to myself, sure, yeah, these guys play this game I had no money at this point in my life still. So I was completely in awe of the stakes that they played for. And sure, they play hands for tens of thousands of dollars at a time. Like it's astronomical. It's unthinkable to me. but these people are not worthy of my respect because I know who I am and I know about my own intelligence and aptitude at gaming. And I mean, objectively, most of these guys are probably not as skilled gamers as I am. I'm pretty certain of that. I don't know how good Phil Hellmuth is. It's really hard for me to even assess that.
He has a special he specializes in multi-table tournaments, and I give him more respect in that area than most people, but that's besides the point.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the impression that he has online, I'm sorry, overtly in videos of him and stuff, is that he's a big donkey. You know, that he's just like looks like he's just constantly tilted because of emotions, and he's constantly trying to make big moves that people just read him perfectly, and he gets crushed, and he's bitter as
That's
hell. And
clearly media manipulated, but
obviously, it's obviously narrative, and of course, he's played to that, right? He understands there's value in being the heel too.
Yes.
You know, any guy that's going to like have himself brought out on like a throne or whatever for a game, you know, like the crazy stunts that he's pulled, right? He understands that there's definitely value to be extracted in that reputation, rightfully so. And you certainly can't argue with it.
And very fair to him, we are not his target demographic. So there's that too.
Yeah. What is his target demographic anyway?
His target demographic. Okay, so I think he doesn't want his cover blown, yet wants the respect. Like, so this is why I think I know what he does. When Barry Greenstein wrote in his book that Hellmuth is good against bad players, but bad against good players, this is kind of what it is. I've played with him in cash games. I never played with him in tournaments, but I watch him interact, and this is how he gets an extra edge in multi-table tournaments. If you or I, who are mostly polite, are dealt the same cards over and over, it plays out. But if you agitate your opponent who doesn't have emotional control,
yeah,
he will, like, his opponent will punt to him or just be off, and he will just like have that part of his game like, honed. So that is where he gets an extra edge, where if somebody punts off to him but doesn't punt off to you or me, wow, dude, you do increase your chances of doing well in the tournament significantly.
Yeah, no, I totally. I mean, that's obviously the Mike Long strategy. I don't know if you ever played against Mike Long, but
I think I did once, but like it was very.
I never encountered any player in my entire career of playing Magic over 26 years who ever threw me off my game more than him. No one even close. He was the only person generally that I dreaded playing against and who I would feel would genuinely rattle me emotionally when I played against him. The only player that could do that.
What did he do?
Well, I have a famous story. I can relate to you about that. And I forgot. I honestly will have to get back to it, but I forgot why we were talking about Phil Hellmuth. Why I wandered off talking about him.
Your disdain for the poker players, but the thing is that part of their attitude is like part of their game, whereas our game development came from a desire of meritocracy. Like if you are the best,
yeah, it relates to that question. Yeah, so we'll get back to the question. We'll just keep that on the back burner, the meritocracy thing. Yeah, because that's obviously a very important thing. Because you asked me the question of, as people who are just fundamental min-max gamers, right? We understand, like in our perfect world, you want to have this meritocracy where the best player always wins, but that is totally obviously incompatible with reality, particularly in poker, because poker is unsustainable if the best player always wins. Like it literally is unsustainable and can't exist.
Yeah.
But getting back to my quick Mike Long story, which people may appreciate. So this is the stage of this story. Long and I are playing at Pro Tour LA number 2, I think. 2 or 3. It's not terribly important. What it is it was one of the very last events where they did a Rochester draft for at the tables. Did you ever draft Rochester? You must have.
I drafted with you, and I remember you not being happy with the format because it's so slow.
Yeah, it is slow. I mean, there's a lot more information. It tests very, very different skills, particularly because signaling and diplomacy is such a big part for the audience. People who are not familiar with Rochester, because it's been long gone. It was retired as a draft format ages ago, at least in Wizards events. But booster draft, you open up a pack of 15. Nobody else sees it. You take one card, you pass the booster to your left side, and that goes around the table until all the packs are drafted. Then you go to the right with a pack, and then to the left with a pack until everybody has 45 picks. In Rochester drafts, a pack is open and presented face up on the table. So 15 cards are face up on the table. One person is designated to go first. They pick one card that's face up. draft proceeds to the left until it gets to the eighth person who picks 2 cards. They're the bounce point. They pick 2, and then it circles back the other way to the person to the original drafter's left, at which point the last card is picked, and the original drafter only gets 1 card. Everybody else gets 2. So in Rochester draft, it's very interesting because you have complete information. You get to see what everybody is picking, and you can adjust your strategy accordingly. So if the guy to your right picks up a very powerful blue card early that has 2 blue in the casting cost, it's a pretty good signal to you to avoid blue because he just took a big blue rare. And now you know that I don't want to take blue, even if the second best card in the pack is also a blue card. It's more advantageous for me in the long term to take a black card that's decent, because that way I'm not competing with my neighbor for blue.
Right.
So there's lots of information in Rochester, which makes it a very fascinating format. It was also often structured, at least in top 8s, that you would know who your first round opponent was as well. You would know the
right. You're crossed over, yeah.
Right, it determined where the seating was. You'd be sitting across from the guy that you would play, so you could see his entire deck as you played, and you could literally draft cards directly against your first round opponent, essentially to hedge to win your first match, because the dollar amounts jumped so much between top 8 and top 4. It was like a more than double increase in value. So anyway, I'm drafting at a table, Rochester draft, with Mike Long and six other people, including Igor Freeman, Michael Lecanto, who was the first Pro Tour champion. I don't know if there are any other name players, but this is big stress. The winner of this table is guaranteed top 8. If you go 3-0, you're guaranteed top 8. If you go 2-0-1, you're probably top 8. If you go 2-1, maybe on tiebreakers. But if you win the table, you're in. So in the we sit down, first round of pairings get out, and I drafted what I feel is a very strong deck, and it's right along the archetype that I've been drafting the whole event: a blue-white-green defensive fortress with banders and flyers.
What were the sets?
Mirage Visions, Rochester draft. So it was just 2 sets, Mirage and Visions. There was no Weatherlight in there yet. Weatherlight came later, so it was just those 2 sets. And the deck that my team had developed to draft in that format, that seemed like it was the most accessible, that you could consistently get it, and that it worked well. Because the best deck was probably like something like blue-black with lots of bounce, like Mana War and Undo and flyers and flankers and stuff. But that deck was very competitive. It was very hard to get the pieces to it consistently because they were all first picks. Whereas the blue-white-green deck had a lot of kind of innocuous pieces that all worked really well together. So cards like Jolt and Ivory Charm and stuff, these kind of garbagey 12th to 13th, 14th picks, were all stars in this deck. They worked really, really well in it. So we drafted this strategy because we knew that we could consistently get it, and it worked great. I mean, I cruised through the Swiss rounds drafting these decks. And so the deck I've drafted is totally in line with that archetype, feels very, very good. In the first round, I get paired up against Michael Lecanto, this very kind of brash, loudmouth, honestly, objectively kind of an asshole, this guy from New England who was the first Pro Tour winner, who has a major chip on his shoulder because after winning the first pro event, he's done very poorly in all subsequent events, which has made everybody really question his ability at the game. I think it's just a fluke. So he's got something to prove. We start to play, and we're midway through the first game when I think Mark Rosewater, or one of the judges, runs over and says, guys, stop. We screwed up the pairings. You're not actually playing. At which point, Michael Lecanto jumps up out of his seat furiously, and he slams 2 copies of Crash of Rhinos on the table. Crash of Rhinos is...
I know, the 8/4 trample, yeah.
8 mana, 8/4 trample, like total garbage by any modern context. Yeah. And pretty garbage in that format too, but at least like the kind of thing, because of banding, it was the kind of thing you might actually put in the deck. Because if you band it to another creature, you can attack with this much larger thing where 8 of the damage is trample and you can get through. Anyway, Michael Lecanto jumps up and in rage, he slams his 2 Crash of Rhinos on the table and he goes, your ass was kicked. Your ass was kicked. That's what he says to me. And I'm like, okay, well, that's nice. Great. Well, I'm glad we didn't have to play that game out then. So I pick up my cards and now I'm paired up against Mike Long. And Long, actually, unlike Mike Lecanto, because I got to see Mike Lecanto draft his deck, where he very sadly took Crash of Rhinos multiple times because it sucks. I'm playing against Long. Long's deck is genuinely good. It's scary. I think his deck is blue-black. And he has, among other things, he has a Necrotal in his deck, which is very, very powerful creature in the format, and multiple ways to return the Necrotal to his hand via Mana War, Shrieking Drake. I think he has an Undo in his deck. He has multiple flyers, black flankers. It's like a really good blue-black deck, and I'm very scared of playing him. So we play our first game, and it's a long, grinding attrition fest. It goes really, really long, and I finally beat him in the late game using my big banding, trampling guys. and I get through and I kill him. Game 2, he gets an early Necrotal and he bounces it multiple times and just destroys me. A total blowout. I lose quite quickly. We go to game 3 and we're kind of running out of time. And at this point, most of the tournament site has cleared out now. There's at least most of the tables are empty, which means that we have a huge audience. We have like 50 people crowded around our table, everybody. And Long is there. And this is a really close game. It's really undecided. He does get his Necrotal early, but I'm able to kill it or deal with it somehow. I think I had one removal spell in my deck, which was a green sorcery called Nyaro Bee Sting, which is
2 damage for 4. I know.
He plays his Necrotal, and before he's able to start bouncing it, I kill it with Nyaro Bee Sting, which I've been saving specifically for that card because I knew it was one of the ways I could lose. Anyway, I have this artifact in play called Magma Mine.
I know it. Yeah.
Remember it?
Yeah.
Magma Mine is, I'm going to look it up real quick because there's one important component to this story. It's about when you can sacrifice it, whether you can sacrifice it during upkeep or whether you can sacrifice it at any time.
I don't know. I think it's upkeep.
Yeah, I'm double checking just to make sure because it's important for continuity here. Let's load. Come on.
You mentored me those sets too.
Yeah, I mean,
when Weatherlight came out, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is back when I can sacrifice it. Okay, so you can sacrifice it at any time for what looks like, yeah, it's just tap and sack. Okay. However, so it's 1 mana, tap and sacrifice Magma Mine to deal damage to any target equal to the number of pressure counters on the Magma Mine. But adding a pressure counter to Magma Mine costs 4 mana. And like any person who's played Magic in the last 15, 20 years would look at Magma Mine and be like, that card is hot garbage. Yeah, it's absolute trash. You would never even consider it. But in that time, in that era, in 1996, in the decks that we were drafting, it was an all-star. It was a total sleeper, along with this card called Telemtor's Darts, which people would just totally dismiss. It's like 3 mana to cast, 2 and tap, deal a damage.
1 damage to player, yeah.
Horrible, right? But in that, you're just doing nothing but gumming up the ground and surviving and pinging them 20 times with a Telemtor's Darts. It was good. So was Magma Mine, right? You could pay 4 mana every turn to keep pumping in and pumping in and pumping in and pumping, and eventually it's lethal.
Yeah.
So we're in this game, and I've got Magma Mine in play. He's blue-black, so he should have no way to deal with it, right? There's outside of like, maybe there's 1 or 2 blue cards that might bounce it, but I haven't seen any, and I don't think he drafted any.
Boomerang was in the set, I believe. But anyway,
what's that?
I think Boomerang was in Mirage.
Maybe not. Yeah, I think so. But I don't think he had a Boomerang in his deck. Maybe he did. Anyway, I got Magma Mine in play, and I'm dutifully pumping mana into it every turn. And initially, I only have enough mana to pump it once per turn. But we're in this stalemate, and eventually I got 8 mana, so now it's going up twice. Meanwhile, Long has managed to kill more of my creatures and now has a flyer that's hitting me undeterred. So I'm taking damage every turn. I have the ground locked up. The only thing that's holding me and keeping me in the game is this Magma Mine that's steadily ticking up. And now it's at 10, and now it's at 11, and 12, and 13. Now I've got 8 mana in play, so I can do it twice a turn. And Long adds another flyer to the mix. Now he's hitting me for 4 a turn, and we're going back and forth. But of course, he knows the math, and he understands that I'm going to win the race because the Magma Mine is too big, and he's at 16 or something, and he's not going to be able to outrun it even with his flyers. So he goes into full Mike Long, throw my opponent off his game mode. And for Mike Long, that means, I'm going to put my microphone over here so I don't knock it off the table. That means sitting in his chair like this, way up in his chair, and he's bouncing around like a, and he's like hopping up and down, chattering at 1,000,000 miles an hour, and he's reaching over and he's checking my graveyard, and he's interacting with the audience. He's just doing every possible thing he can to get in my head, and it's working. It's totally working. I'm getting like, my heart is pounding because this is top 8 on the line. This will be the second time that I'll have made a top 8, the first time in an unlimited event. I really, really want to win. Like, I really want to make a top 8. Obviously, the money means the world to me because I don't have any money. And I got to get past Mike Long, who's one of the toughest players you could possibly not hope to face in a Magic event. And he's fucking rattling me. And like, my heart is pounding, and I'm being super, super deliberate and systematic with everything I do. And I'm already a very deliberate player anyway, but I'm being extra careful that I don't miss a goddamn thing, because if I miss one activation of my Magma Mine at any point, I'm going to die to the flyers. The math doesn't work out, but it still works out in my favor. So we get down to the penultimate turn, and Long hits me with the creatures, and I drop down to 3 or something. And I have 9 mana in play or something, and I've got Magma Mine in play, and it's at 12 counters, and he's at 16. And so I go, okay, you're done. You're done. Like I make sure he's done. Okay, Mike, at the end of your turn, I tap 8 mana and I pump the Magma Mine up to 14. And he goes, okay. I'm like, okay, he doesn't have a boomerang. I untap. Okay, during my upkeep, before anything else happens, pay 8 mana, pump up Magma Mine once, twice, it's at 16. We both acknowledge that. And like the crowd is just pressing in, you know, my heart is thudding. And I'm like, this has to work. This has to work. This is the game. This gets me into, you know, the next round. And I think I can win out. And I go, okay, I sacrifice my Magma Mine and I deal 16 to you. And Long, without missing a beat, still bouncing up, reaches into his hand and he throws a card face down on the table and he goes, I rust it.
What?
Because I cast Rust.
Oh. It's not in the set.
And I go, oh my God. And I put my head down on the table, like he had Rust. I can't believe it. How on earth could he have Rust? It's just so insane that he would have that card. Why would he be playing with that card? And I'm going through I literally see this green card on the table that it's Rust. And the crowd just gasps. And this moment just hangs in time for about 7-8 seconds. And then Long cackles loudly and scoops up his cards and concedes. Because Rust is
doesn't on the set. Yeah.
Legends that's green.
Yeah.
It's it's not even in the card pool or anything. And it's green. He couldn't possibly have it, right?
Yeah.
And yet he was so inside my head that, you know, had the situation been sort of had less gravity to it, it's entirely possible that I would have been like, fuck, he got me. Concede then, I guess. I died to the Flyers. Because I just spent all my mana and my upkeep to pump the Magma Mine.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So I mean, it's still that story still gives me PTSD to an extent because of what was on the line. But it does say something not only just about his skill in terms of getting in someone's head, but it speaks to kind of things that I'm sure that he did, because obviously Long has a reputation for bending the rules in his favor in many ways. He was caught famously at U.S. Nationals with a critical card in a combo deck that he was playing under his leg in his lap that fell on the
Prosperous Bloom, anyway.
Yes, the famous Prosperous Bloom incident. Whether or not he was cheating in that situation, I don't feel like there's enough evidence really to say either way. It certainly is very suspicious. It could be something that's entirely innocent. I think that if I were playing that deck and I wanted access to one card at all times, it wouldn't be Prosperous Bloom. It would probably be the Squandered Resources that was the other part of the combo. But anyway, he had a unique skill to get into people's minds in a way that nobody else could. And I'm sure that in a similar situation, if he's playing, like, let's say a casual game against somebody or a game just in an early Swiss round off in the corner, and he has no other choice, then his opponent goes, okay, I'm going to deal lethal to you. And Long just throws a red card on the table and goes, bolt you. And the guy goes, oh, shit, damn it. And he picks up his cards and concedes. Like the way that the rules were back then, you were not punished for doing that. There was actually no official rebuke. There was nothing in the rules that addressed doing something like that. And even if you did get caught by a judge, the worst thing you would do is just get a warning. They would just say, oh, please don't do that again. Nowadays, you're like instant game loss or match loss or worse, right? If you misrepresent a card. But 1996 Magic was the Wild West, and Mike Long was the sheriff for sure. He was someone you did not want to face. I had a great record against him though. Whenever he and I played, we played I think 3 times in the Pro Tour. We played at Pro Tour Paris, where he played Prosperous Bloom. We played in that event, and we also played in the Type 1 event too, the one in Dallas, and I was 2-1 against him. So winning record against Mike Long in pro competition, at least.
So regarding poker, the thing is, like, when Phil Hellmuth says he's the greatest of all time, and he believes it, the thing is, like, he's playing his own game. One, in his mind of meritocracy, the only thing that really proves the best poker player of all time is multi-table tournaments and therefore bracelet events. Because even in the podcast, and I totally agree with them, it is really hard to judge who the best cash game player is because not all fields are equal. Obviously, for somebody like you and me who care more about, I mean, we would love to have the titles, but, we're playing poker for money. So, we care about the cash more. But Phil Hellmuth's poker legacy is very important to him personally for many reasons. And I think you and I at least have the appreciation that with the games that we participate in, we would like whatever we contributed to be acknowledged. So he wants that acknowledgement of being the greatest poker player of all time, but on his terms, which are multi-table tournaments, bracelets, keeping the game alive, being in poker history. And I think that when people diss him, one, he's been portrayed in media unfairly in a sense that a lot of the hands that are on video are the entertaining ones where he blows up or,
Right, of course.
whatnot.
Yeah, obviously, there's huge confirmation bias involved in the production of those.
Right. And on at least Live at the Bike, I have seen him like outweigh people or whatever. Cash games are not a specialty. But in the context of his definition of greatest poker player of all time, he actually fits that caveat in which if you're trying to define him in a different sense, easily he's not the best player of all time. So, one thing that poker does as a game versus Magic has a little bit of a component, as you showed with Mike Long, is you're trying to break parity. You don't want the meritocracy. You're trying to find whatever you can do, whether it's strategically, verbally, gestures, whatever, in an ethical sense,
right,
to break parity. And he does that. Like, definitely people like Antonio Esfandiari and Phil Hellmuth and, Phil Locke, their speech play attempts to break this parity.
Interesting.
So that's something that we, as even though it's a very small component of Magic, live Magic, for the most part, you want to be known. You personally want to be known in Magic as a theorist, deck builder, and execution, not so much the manipulation.
Right, exactly.
You do have part of that in you, though. But that's
Yeah,
why. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say you're totally right about that. I mean, I think obviously doing things within the confines of the rules, you're obviously familiar with the term angle shooting, and you have to be careful about walking that line between strategy, getting into your opponent's head, manipulation, and overt angle shooting, right? And I think that probably it's somewhere in between the getting in your opponent's head and actually angle shooting where you start to fall into territory where most people would consider that, well, I mean, reputable or disreputable conduct, to the point where people would start to really frown on you as a player and as a person. And I don't know I don't think that I would qualify or classify any of Phil Hellmuth's shenanigans as angle shooting, because
exactly.
They're not. They're definitely within the confines of the game, and certainly, I mean, acting tilted about stuff, berating people for their play. Sure, it makes you look like an asshole, but you're right. In a game where you are trying to extract every dollar of potential equity, because it can't just be a meritocracy. Obviously, it can't be, because then it's just a zero-sum game in the long run. You do need to exert some sort of thing. I mean, in the case of Magic, for example, I've got them right here. To this day, when I play old school, these are two 20-sided dice.
Yeah.
These two dice, not these exact two, but two dice play an integral part of my strategy to this day, because the physical aspect of manipulating a 20-sided die in terms of what you can project to your opponent and how much you can get people to actually block or not block or take damage or do whatever by just literally picking up a die and adjusting it. It's profound, actually, the effect that this can have on people, where you say, I'm going to attack you for 2, and you reach over and you just pick their die up and you start to turn it. And that this is not demonstrative of anything, right? They have to legally declare a block, and then there's time to do everything. But when you pick the die up and you start to turn it, they get fixated by that, and they start thinking, damn, I don't really want to take 2. Like, he's picked up the die. Or that's awfully presumptuous of him to pick the die up and start turning. I haven't even declared a block yet. Fuck yeah, I'm going to block, which is exactly what you want them to do, which is why you picked up the die in the first place. And they don't even realize that you did that was an overt choice. I specifically picked the die up because I'm trying to induce them to block, and I want them to resent the fact that I picked the die up. That's like a little sort of intangible thing that's obviously within the confines of the rules completely. It's not angle shooting. There's no cheating going on there, but clearly there's some degree of manipulation going on there, even if it's rather covert. And I guess, so Phil Hellmuth's strategies are kind of in line with that. And I can totally understand that. I can totally get it. I just, obviously, from my perspective, that's not how I would ever try to eke out an advantage.
Right.
Because
Because of our background, and we don't view like,
well, particularly on the subject of legacy, what kind of legacy is he trying to have? You know, does he want to be infamous and known
no.
for all time as one of the most abrasive, awful people who ever sat at a poker table and made countless opponents just feel horrible?
He's
Is
fairly
that
proud of that, but that's not so much like if you listen to all his dialogue, and I'm wondering how many people are actually going to listen to this that, also have the crossover. But what's important to him are bracelets, longevity, what people are like, whether he could say he's the greatest, and actual performance. If that is his criteria, and he's, relatively proud of being a brat, so call that irrelevant.
yeah?
Because I think that if being kind and not abrasive was the correct strategy, he's happy to do that too. I've seen a nice side to him that other people may not have seen. Whatever the case is, under those four criteria, which, longevity is a huge one because that's something that's hard for, poker players in general.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it seems like a crazy thing to want to do with your life for 30 years or 40 years. I mean, it's just, there's so
That's
many.
right. That's for us, but he's been passionate about it for like, when you were playing Street Fighter and then Magic and then,
Exactly.
Diablo.
Helmut was playing poker the whole time, of course.
Yeah, Helmut's been playing the whole time. So in the context of his definition, and I'm not even sure it's like that off, he really is like one of the greats. Like
I
there's
think
no
indisputably, yes, of course.
I just mean under his own definition,
I think
his own
an objective
criteria.
definition would. I mean, does he have the most bracelets still? He
Yeah.
does, right?
He has 15, yeah.
That's then it's indisputable. Honestly, that's the biggest litmus test I think of someone truly being great is how many gigantic events have you won? Because it's not like you can just play in every event and you're just accumulate bracelets over time, right? That's not how it
Well,
works.
there's one caveat to that, which is when people are sponsored, especially like Daniel Negreanu, so you could just keep spamming tournaments, then yeah, that's kind of messing with stuff. But that's the thing. That's why, a poker career isn't so much of a meritocracy, because there are so many things that make it that it's not a fair competition. And whether it's like talk, play, strategy, there's a lot of stuff to manipulate things because your whole goal is to break parity.
Yeah. Well, on the subject of meritocracy in games, getting back to that initial point that you made, I think that there is definitely a tendency among cerebral, skilled lifestyle players. There's always this tendency to sort of drift in that direction over time, particularly because once you develop prodigious skill at something, be it poker or magic or whatever, it engenders a degree of expectation about the outcome of every single game you play. You start to have the expectation. You transition, particularly when you're learning something that people already understand better than you because they've been doing it longer. You start out with this expectation, like, I'm just going to have fun, I'm just going to do this, and I'm going to learn it. And then gradually transition, once you gain aptitude at that, you transition over to starting to have the expectation that you should win more than your fair share of games. As you get very, very
Right.
good at something, that gives way to being that almost a sense of entitlement, right? I
Yes.
deserve to win these
Exactly.
games, right? I not only expect to, but I deserve to because I put in the time. I know this better than anyone. These are the kind of things you hear Phil Jones saying at the table, right? Which makes
Yeah.
him so distasteful to so many people. I deserve to win this. I'm entitled to win this. And if there's one thing that people generally react to universally badly, it's a sense of entitlement. People generally can't stand people who act entitled. The problem is that when you really have spent and put in the time, it's hard to not feel entitled to a certain degree to the
I agree.
wins.
Yeah.
And that compulsion, I think, compels people, first of all, as players of something, to become resentful when they don't do well at things. But consequently, if they wind up getting involved in game development down the road, as many people who are avid gamers do, they start to think that I want to go and create a game where it is a meritocracy. I want to remove the randomness, the frustrating random components from a game and make it much more deterministic and more skill based, which is, in my opinion, a very, very dark road to go down when it comes to the
Really.
game. Yes. Oh, absolutely. You just need to take a look at example. Okay. How many games in the world have tried to do what Magic does, have tried to essentially mimic Magic, but have removed the primary endemic component of RNG in Magic. And when I say RNG, that's, random number
generator, yeah.
Which is the primary non-deterministic thing in Magic, of course, because nearly all the cards are deterministic. When I lightning bolt my opponent's creature, it deals 3 to it. It doesn't deal 1 to 3.
Yeah.
Right? It deals 3. The determinism in Magic is in what the cards do, and the randomness is almost entirely wrapped up into the mana of the game. Whether or not you draw sufficient lands to play your spells, whether you draw enough spells to play the game, and whether you draw, in many cases, the right colors to cast those spells. There's sort of 3 different components to that. And good deck construction and good play is designed around mitigating all 3 of those things to make them as deterministic as possible within the confines of whatever format you're playing. So for example, in limited formats, which I'm honestly not that big of a fan of, because I feel that the mana control in limited formats is so much often out of my control that so many games feel like they just are fundamentally decided by the RNG endemic to the mana system. It has nothing to do with who draws better cards. It's just like we're in a stalemate and I draw 3 lands out of 4 cards while my opponent draws 4 threats in a row and I just lose. And it's such a frustrating way to lose a game of Magic, obviously. That you have those experiences over and over and over again. You see that your skill directly correlates to your ability to win the game. You start thinking, aha, I've figured out how to make a better game. We're going to make Magic, but it's not going to have random mana. It's going to have deterministic mana. Every single version of every card game, to the best of my knowledge, that's come along in the last 25 plus years, with the exception of Hearthstone, has failed commercially. I mean, I guess Pokemon has flourished because Pokemon is, this overlap with collectability among children and stuff. But obviously without the appeal to children, Pokemon doesn't succeed. And I guess Yu-Gi-Oh is also out there, but I think Yu-Gi-Oh also a kid's game. I don't know enough about it mechanically.
I don't know about either of them
to understand if they've addressed it. But nearly every other game that's tried to solve mana in the confines of a card game has failed, and failed badly. While Magic has just continued to flourish with its crazy warty mana system intact, always. And they've been it's been mitigated a little bit by improving on the mulligan system. The mulligan system has steadily evolved from being literally no mulligan to the all land, no land mulligan system, to the Paris mulligan system, to the London mulligan system, which is certainly the best. Actually, I guess there was temporarily the Scry, the mulligan Scry system, which was around for a little while, and then finally the London mulligan system, which is
what is the London mulligan system?
It's definitely the best compromise. So what it is for a little while, I think Pat Chapin actually was the one who came up with the Scry mulligan. That was his suggestion, as far as I know. But basically, the last mulligan system we use, in case you're not familiar with it, is if you have to mulligan, you redraw 1 fewer card. However, you additionally you get to scry 1. So you look at the top card of your library. If you don't like it, you can put it on the bottom, and then you're set. If you mulligan twice, it's draw 5, scry 1, and so on, just like the Paris mulligan. The problem with that is of course, is that even with the scry, a 5-card hand, just from the perspective of what decks are trying to accomplish, is just so crippled that if you're trying to make Magic a legit game, more of a meritocracy, at least as far as at the high levels of play, to have a Pro Tour finals or something decided because the guy redraws a 5-card hand and he has to keep it because he doesn't want to go to 4, and then his scry doesn't reveal anything, and then he misses land 2 turns in a row, and then he just loses. It's so anticlimactic and bad from the perspective of promoting the game and the viewership and everything that Pro Tour is meant to represent, that it doesn't make sense to have that mulligan system. So the new mulligan system, which I think is a massive net positive net gain for the game in almost all formats. It's very abusable in some formats, unfortunately, but I think that the cost of it being abusive in the older formats is worth its advantages in particularly limited formats, but also in standard. And the way it works is if you and I are playing and I mulligan, rather than redrawing 1 fewer card and drawing only 6, I draw up to 7. But I then have to take whatever number of cards equal to the number of mulligans I've taken and put those cards on the bottom of my library.
Okay.
So if I mulligan twice, I draw 7, choose 2, and put the 2 on the bottom. I now have a 5-card starting hand, but it's the best of 7.
Yeah.
And the difference in that, it may not seem like that big of a deal to someone who's just thinking about the difference between drawing 5, scrying 1 versus drawing 7, putting 2 on the bottom. It doesn't seem like that big of a difference. But it's literally the difference between random and choice discard. you've ever been hit by a hypnotic specter, you know how bad that feels. Like literally one hit of a hypnotic specter can ruin your entire game plan. I keep 2 lands, right? I go land, or my opponent goes land, ritual, specter. I go play my land, go, and they go attack with the specter. Oh, I knocked the other land out of your hand, and you kept an entire hand that was based on drawing having 2 mana, and your next land is 6 cards down. You just died on the spot to discard 1 effect. It's that bad, right? The difference between the London mulligan and the Paris mulligan is the difference between random and choice discard. Now it's draw 7 cards of my choice, discard 2 of them to the bottom of my deck. That's choice. If it's draw 5 and never draw those 2, then there's 2 random cards I don't get to draw that are on top of my deck. That's random discard, and that's night and day. So I think that the mechanical change between those 2 mulligans is enormous in terms of still feeling fair, but preserving an interactability in the game that didn't exist with the Paris mulligan, where you just feel like you're just gutted if you mulligan to 5. It just feels hopeless. I mean, I'm sure you've experienced it hundreds and hundreds of times in your Magic experience and how bad that is.
Sure.
But anyway, but there's a habit. This is a habit that actually has to be weaned out of, or that a lot of former pro players have to be weaned off of when they go to work in Magic R&D. And that's that they want to design Magic for the pro perspective. They want to, and one of the common things that occurs over and over and over again is this desire to take randomness out of the game. They want to make it more deterministic because they believe that determinism favors the better player. And it does to an extent, but the problem is, just like in poker, if poker were entirely deterministic, poker's done in how many months? How long does it take before all the bad players lose all their money and quit? It's like happens overnight. The game is just over.
Yeah, the survivability of games relies on it to overall be a meritocracy, but have a lot of variables and a little, even in non-orange, even in real-time games, variance is a good thing. One of the reasons I feel like StarCraft fell out of favor is that whoever's better is just too obvious.
Totally.
So like tennis. Yeah, chess, tennis, like those games tend to have more of a meritocracy and less variance. And something like League of Legends, which is obviously also real time, but a MOBA, has more variance when it comes to teammates, picks, like opponents, like the opponent's civil war versus your civil war. That
and the way that the heroes themselves, I assume, match up as well too. Specific heroes matching up against each other.
Right. So there's definitely a strategy element, but there's also a variable element. Also, there's a skill difference element. But I always joke that League of Legends, kind of like poker, if you win, it's your skill. If you lose, it's your teammate's bad.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that's what a lot of people say, obviously, right? They just
So that element allows people to stick. Another psychological thing that allows people to stick in the game longer. Where StarCraft's like you beat somebody 10 times, they're like, forget it, I'm out.
Yeah, I mean, in StarCraft, the better player is going to win 1,000 times in a row, probably, unless the other player in that span of games is capable of improving to some large extent. But yeah, it's just like in chess, right? Like a grandmaster playing against a decent amateur will just literally never lose. Like there's just no way to ever beat him.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason why I don't think chess is a particularly good game. Chess has its own cachet and its own appeal to certain people, and it's certainly very accessible because all you need is a chessboard. But as a game, compared to modern games like Magic, it's so wanting. It's just it fails to satisfy in so many fundamental ways.
Right. So design-wise, I agree, and like there's like even poker is criticized, but the thing is, and I have this on my Live with Black Poker podcast, is that the one thing that's for sure is that chess and poker are going to survive as long as humanity do, with the amount of interest, because one, you're introducing them at a younger age. Two, you could pick them up at any time in your lifetime, whereas like games like StarCraft, Path of Exile, Magic, it's just too like the evolution plus like the format, it can be restrictive or it's ever evolving, so it can change so much that's not the same thing, or like the hardware or the hardware requirements gets to be higher so other things can take it over, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, well, I mean, eventually people, I'm sure that a time will come when interfacing with games is sort of like Ready Player One style. Right? Yeah. Well, it's more like the reality that exists in the Ready Player One story. that basically gaming has transcended the standard way that we interface with gaming traditionally, keyboard and mouse, right? And has moved to entirely, like games take place entirely in your brain and it's indistinguishable from reality and so on. Like games will eventually, almost certainly become that. And people will look back at a game like StarCraft and it'll look just downright quaint.
Exactly.
Why would you play StarCraft in that format when you can literally be a Marine on the battlefield fighting real Zergs and stuff, and it feels like you're on a battlefield fighting Zergs?
It's partially what humans, what we enjoy interpreting things as, because like it's more apparent with industries where like most people favor a subset like X industries when the field is like Y industries, and the fields that you're not interested in, it's just like it's so hard to like you could have an intellectual curiosity to listen to them, but you're just never gonna really delve deeply into something that you don't have affinity towards. Same thing with games. There's X genres, and I consider both of us like intellectually curious into many game formats, but I'm sure there's some game formats that neither of us are curious to, where it's like,
Match 3 games.
huh? Match 3, yeah.
Match 3 games, yeah.
That's I mean that's part of my thing too. Yeah, but they're a legit form because there's a demand for them. So
Totally.
some
Billions of
people
dollars are spent on match 3 games every single year. So there's no denying it. I mean, that sort of speaks a little bit to just a kind of inherent ignorance, getting back to what we were talking about at the beginning about Joe Rogan just slagging on games as a general thing. I mean, that's basically like there's about as much wisdom in that statement as saying that books are dumb or movies are dumb and that people who watch movies or read books are dumb. It's just, what the hell are you saying, man? It's just ridiculous. You're talking about such a gigantic swath of humanity, and you're talking about a form, an art form that's as diverse as anything else, and in some cases far more diverse. I mean, games, in terms of what games are and what can be gamified, there is basically no limit to that. And I mean, people can gamify incredibly intimate stories of romance and heartbreak and child abuse and all sorts of crazy things can be completely explained in game form. There's like a game that was really, really popular about, I feel like I played it right around when we were starting developing PoE. So it's sort of in like '08, a game called Braid, Braid. And Braid won tons and tons of awards and was really kind of a very good early example of games as art. But it's a relatively simple platformer game where you play as this protagonist named Tim, and you're trying to rescue this girl. That's sort of like the overarching theme of the game. But there's all of these weird intertwining themes related to time and time's effect on human sensibilities and regret and remorse and love and betrayal and all of these other things. And they're all kind of intertwined throughout the game. And time is this sort of mechanical undercurrent in the game. So you have all of these puzzles that you solve. Every world that there's like 5 different versions of the world that you go through, and each one has a different rule as far as how time flows and how you can interact with it. And it all relates to this larger story, and it has beautiful music. It's just an unbelievably incredible game. And to play that and have that experience, and then have someone like Rogan come along and talk about how games are dorky. That Magic. I remember he talked about Magic the Gathering specifically in one of his recent. I don't remember who it was with. It was some like Henry Rollins lookalike guy, and they were. Oh, it was because of the controversy about the whole Therese Nielsen thing.
I think the card was Invoke Justice, I guess. I mean, I'm not.
You're thinking of Invoke Prejudice, although that was
Prejudice. Yeah.
Harold McNeil is actually the person that painted that, but Therese Nielsen was another Magic artist who also painted cards in the early going. I think she most famously painted the card Force of Will. Is her most iconic piece. But Therese Nielsen apparently is like an alt-right supporter, and she was posting tweets in support of alt-right points of view, and she donated pieces of artwork to some, I think, like a QAnon conspiracy podcast or something. Like, she did a lot of. I mean, it's contemptible if those are your sensibilities, right? I look at it and I go like, what the fuck is this? Like, obviously this woman's crazy, and believing and advocating for this stuff is nuts and totally irresponsible. I mean, it's totally within her rights, right? I mean, it's within her rights to support those things. At the same time, Wizards of the Coast as a business who by extension promotes its artists through including their artwork on their cards, Wizards of the Coast has every right and reason to say we no longer want to do business with Teresa Nielsen because we don't want to be associated with people who are associated with QAnon and the alt-right. I think that's totally reasonable as well. That's why they were discussing that's why it came up in the conversation. And they, of course, cast it as like, oh, so now Magic's all woke and they've totally gotten, into this same exact culture, this cancel culture, and now you're not allowed to have blah, I think they took it too far, certainly with regards to the, like these cards are all banned now because we've just decided that jihad is, somehow culturally insensitive in 2000 when it was printed in 1993, you're not allowed to use it.
Yeah.
And then cards like cleanse, for example, destroys all black cards in play. There are some that are much more overt, like invoke prejudice, which if you look at it,
Clearly it's not good. Yeah.
It looks like it's got a bunch of kind of ghostly guys that are wearing clan hoods in it.
Yeah.
I get that would upset people, but I think by and large, I don't think that there were a lot of people that were lobbying to have Pradesh gypsies expunged from the Magic Gatherer for all time because people found the portrayal of Pradesh gypsies to be offensive. Like, I mean, yeah, gypsies were a thing, right? Gypsies, I don't know if there still are a thing, but that was a name that I don't believe that calling some or referring to a group of people as gypsies was a cultural slur. I'm not sure why. And they took it really far. Like one of the other cards that was banned was Stone Throwing Devils, which is a picture. It's an Arabian Nights common, 1/1.
I know it is first strike. Yeah.
Right. And the picture clearly shows like devilly guys. They're clearly devils. They're not people hurling rocks. And sure, if you really stretch your mind, it can be an allusion to the fact that in Islam, one of the prescribed punishments is stoning. It's not unique to Islam, obviously, but historically, stoning was a way that at least societal punishment was meted out onto wrongdoers, right? And so they had this illusion that somehow stone throwing devils was a racial slur against Muslims. I guess that was their idea or something. But I mean, it's absurd.
I mean,
totally absurd. Like, nobody was complaining about that. At least I've never heard it. I've been playing Magic as long as nearly anyone, and I've never ever seen anybody point the finger at stone throwing devils and say, "You guys have a problem here." I did hear about invoke prejudice numerous times.
But even jihad, it was printed in Arabian Nights, and it's like the effect is still positive, right? It's like all creatures get +2,
Totally.
+1 or something.
And jihad, as I best understand it, also does not have negative connotations in Islam. It's jihad like got this negative connotations as a result of how jihads were declared against certain figures. Like, for example, when Salman Rushdie published the Satanic Verses, and a lot of Islamic clerics, probably most of them who never even wrote it or read the book, but believed that there was a negative portrayal of the Prophet Muhammad in the Satanic Verses. And so they issued a fatwa against Salman Rushdie and declared jihad against him to have, basically compelling good Muslims around the world to either punish or outright kill Salman Rushdie for his heresy against Islam. That's sort of how it was portrayed. But as far as I know, jihad it basically just means to sort of take charge of something in your life and make it sort of a focal point of your life, to sort of focus on doing something big in your life that's monumental, sort of a big shift in your life, and to sort of make that the focal point. That's at least my understanding of it. There's certainly nothing racially, ethnically, religiously insensitive about that as a card. And the card, like you said, is a net positive. I believe you play jihad and you name a color, and as long as your opponent controls creatures of that color, now your guys get +2/+1 because they have, jihad against that color.
Sure.
But it's like nondescript. It could be a jihad against green, like so you're anti-plant now, or jihad against blue. I don't know a lot of blue people. It's pretty dumb. Like obviously, it's a pretty slippery slope to go down. And plus, there's tons of cards left out there that you could rightfully make the same exact excuse for. There's a card called Martyr's Cry from the Dark that I believe destroys all white creatures in play, but they didn't destroy Martyr's Cry. I'm not saying that there's anything, like I'd be the last person on earth to say something stupid like all lives matter, in denigration of the Black Lives Matter movement. Obviously that's hideous to say and completely misses the point. But the point is that if you're banning cards for being racially insensitive, then why is Martyr's Cry around still? It doesn't make any sense. It's totally inconsistent. It just makes their decision look more foolish. That's my stake on it. I just think it's a slippery slope to go down and kind of dumb because honestly, nobody really cares. And I understand that they did this as a corporate decision. They probably just decided that it would cost them more to have cards like that in, on Magic Gatherer that people might look at and point at down the road than it would be to just pretend like they didn't exist and just expunge them all. But I do think it sets a bad precedent in general, because it's sort of this weird appeasement, but who are you really trying to appease? Like, who's the person that says, at last, thank God they got rid of Pradesh gypsies. I've been so angry about this for 25 years since Legends came out.
I've had to make some strange changes on broadcast in which I don't agree with the decision, but it's so light that whatever, I don't really care. So, you know the movie Office Space?
Yes, I love that movie. I was talking
Me
about it
too.
yesterday. There was a guy that was running for governor of Washington, who is a spitting image of Milton from Office Space. Like, he looks exactly like him, and he has nothing in his bio either. It's just a picture of a guy who looks like Milton and some dude's name, and he's running for governor. But continue.
So, and a shout out to Mike Judge. So, I had the thing when somebody's dealt pocket queens, I say he's dealt two chicks at the same time,
Okay.
which
Yes.
I thought that was, obviously it was a tribute to Office
Hey, what is
Space.
the
And
character's name? His friend, right? The guy who's like, that's all
yeah,
he
the
wants.
neighbor.
He had $1 million. He would do two chicks at the same time.
Yeah, in the comment section, which usually, if they're too toxic, too ridiculous, I'm just like, I either troll them back or I ignore. So I took this one seriously because they said, it's just like, what are you, a little kid? This is like insensitive to women. And I did take it seriously and I brought it back. I'm like, I, I, I agree with you, but at the same time, this is something where it doesn't hurt me to pull back. So
Right.
I just chose to, I asked the people in the back and they're like, obviously, and I did say it's a tribute to the movie, and they're like, yeah, but it was a tribute in this kind of a fashion. And I'm like,
I mean,
this
obviously,
does
that's the same calculus that Wizards made clearly, right? It's just sort of just saying it costs us so little to do this versus the potential upside. This
right.
maybe imagined, but potential upside. I think honestly the greatest harm in doing things like that, particularly with regards to like someone that would get outraged about what you do, is that I'm really careful about giving people that tend to be hysterical and conspiratorial more things to latch onto and more things to point at as evidence that their insane conspiracy is true. And so, for example, if they have a perception, like for example, if you've ever argued with somebody who's a big fan of Ben Shapiro, for example, they'll tell you that there's this like big push on liberal campuses to quash critical thinking and conversation, that it's woke culture, and they'll push aside and denigrate anything that doesn't adhere to their insulated liberal philosophy. And they want to do crazy things like grant equal rights to transgendered people and let them use bathrooms even when they're not men or women, and blah, 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 right? This is this sort of like absurd conspiracy theory that literally matters to no one. Like, no one gives a shit about any of that in the broader sense. It's totally false outrage that this person is using to try to gin up outrage. The problem is that when you create controversies, you create your own controversies, and you start ascribing all this extra meaning to things that don't fundamentally really matter to very many people, you create ammunition for people like Ben Shapiro to point at. You create ammunition for people like Joe Rogan to point at in his podcast, to say, haha, look how dumb they are. This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is the kind of shit that happens when liberals get in charge of things. They start wanting to ban everything that's culturally insensitive. What's next? Like, you just you provide fodder to these people for no reason, for no gain at all. And you have to be really, really careful about doing that. It's just like when people misquote and I'm sorry, we're sort of diving a little bit into politics, but like this irritated me back when John McCain and Sarah Palin were running for president together. And obviously, I'm a dyed in the wool secular humanist progressive, and I couldn't stand, particularly Sarah Palin, couldn't stand John McCain much either. But I remember Sarah Palin being misquoted after that interview that she did with Charlie Rose, where because of something that Tina Fey said on Saturday Night Live, it became a meme that she said that she could see Russia from her house, which is something she never actually said at all. It was misquoted a million times. I kept having to tell people, she didn't fucking say that. She never said that at all. Yeah. Right? She said that she said something even stupider, honestly. She said that she had foreign policy experience because there are parts of Alaska where you can see Russian land. That's what she said. That was what she actually said. Which, when you're trying to burnish your foreign policy experience to someone who's interviewing you for vice president, sounds pretty stupid, right? all you need to do is just point at that. You don't need to go and mischaracterize what she said, because then when you do that, everyone goes, see, she never said that. We have proof. Tina Fey said that, fake news. She's totally reputable. And everybody's just trying to do character assassination on her. You give ammunition to those people. So be very careful about quoting people who say plenty of dumb things on their own and ascribe things that they said that aren't true. Like, for example, Donald Trump never said inject yourself with bleach. He never said that. Clearly never said that. He said something far stupider. He turned to his doctor and said we should waste time and resources on having people shine ultraviolet light on the lung tissues of dying COVID patients. And we should look into having people go and use sanitizers and so on inside the body. Like, that's totally insane and stupid, right? But he never said inject yourself with bleach. And when you go and say that he said that, now you suddenly change the conversation and you allow people to say, aha, we were right all along. The press hates Donald Trump and they always lie about him. So you have to be careful.
My decision wasn't so much of that particular person. Like, my decision is more like thinking of like my exes and what would they have said, and they would probably say something like this, like, it's not that big of a deal, but would it hurt to not say something, say that? And I would probably agree. So I think that has more influence in the sense that maybe somebody's tolerating it. That's like, does it hurt to not say it? I'll be like, sure. Like, one of the things, because women are treated so poorly in the male dominated industries and the poker environment, I don't mind.
Poker is particularly sensitive about it, of course, yeah.
Right. So in that context, I'm totally okay with whatever. It's not the poster. Like, they brought the poster to the forefront. Everybody I talk to thinks it's funny, but it's highly possible that this is just another inching towards something that's not a neutral environment. So that's just my choice.
And the truth of the matter is, at the end of the day, and it's just like what's at the heart of, people refusing to call transgendered people by their self-described gender. It costs you nothing to do it. Like,
right.
What's the deal, right? In terms of what the difference that it makes to them, to that person, to be identified in something, right? It's such a big deal to them. It hurts you zero to do it, right? Unless there's something just wrong with your brain.
Right. So
it costs you nothing. So why not do it? It's just, I don't even understand it. So in your perspective, I can totally get it. You're like, okay, my bad. I didn't realize, I thought that this was funny. And I get that to some people, they find it really offensive. And yeah, I can stop. Like, it's not so important to me that I need to die on this hill. Right. I don't feel so entitled to my outrage and opinions that I won't change my mind about it.
Yeah. So whatever. And because the way we grew up was pre-internet and it was like a smaller environment, so these things get contested far less. But now everything, it's like, okay, what, 3 billion plus people are connected on the internet? You know what? It's just like, it's the amount of people who are connected on the internet. It's like crazy. So like, and I got in this discussion about, like, you and I obviously are sarcastic certain times and take sarcasm well, but that's not necessarily universal towards the public, and people can misinterpret, they can misread, and it just, we're older now, and this is a different world than what we grew up in. So I'm okay adapting a little bit.
Yeah, I think that I think fundamentally you need to be adaptable, and never feel so entitled to your perspective or point of view that you are certain that you know better than everyone else. Because certainly if numerous amounts of people are pointing something out to you repeatedly, it's probably you that's wrong and not all of them, most likely.
Right.
At a certain point, you sort of do have to defer to the will of the group, the will of the collective.
Yeah, and of course, like, this podcast in general is more of a defense and like an encouragement. Like, if you are a young person proficient in games and everybody around you is like saying, this is bad, this is what, it's like, there are so many career paths. There's like incredibly successful people, Brian Weisman included, and just like, I'm communicating personal experiences. So for the people that know me on broadcast and the stuff I'm gonna do in the future, whatever credibility I have, I'm going to be like, my experiences with you were, incredibly positive. And just like I said, for a lot of the, you mentoring like a lot of people, but the mentorship you gave me, a lot of lessons, I got to execute them in future times in Magic when you weren't around. And it was because of these small things that you did. I remember them for, whereas like, I have a lot of gaming experiences. Like,
yeah. I
Honestly,
mean,
I don't remember squat.
it's very heartening to hear that. I mean, obviously that's the goal. I've said this many, many times that I owe nearly all of the success in my life, honestly, to the fact that I happened to have discovered Magic in 1994. And getting back to what I was saying, I took it very seriously from the moment that I saw it. I just recognized there's something special here, and I feel that this is worthy of my time, my intellectual devotion, my work ethic, study, everything. That this is really something that I feel I could sort of recognize and find myself in. And even though I had countless detractors, friends and family among them, foremost among them, and people teasing me for it and so on, I always was confident that I was doing the right thing because I felt driven in a way that I had never felt driven about anything else. And that's what I would say to kids, that are really into gaming. And nowadays, obviously, it's much easier for people to point at real success stories. There are people making literally millions of dollars a year as professional gamers. Those people, unfortunately, just like professional sports athletes, are the anomalies. They're not a general reflection of how a normal person can go. But you can't know if you're going to be one of those people unless you at least try.
Right.
And try as hard as you can and be confident that you're doing the right thing. Believe in yourself and believe in your long-term goals. You just have to be secure in the notion that you know better for yourself than other people do. You just have to be secure in that notion. And I always was. I always felt, even during the super lean years when Magic wasn't giving me any money, I knew that I was doing things, changing and working and developing my mind and my relationships in a way that would pay dividends later. And it absolutely did. Everyone that I know that led to me being successful in game development and in business in general was all an outgrowth of those years that I invested in Magic. It was like a completely integral and irreplaceable part of it. It never happened. Like nothing in my life that I've enjoyed in the last 15 years happens if I don't devote myself completely to Magic for that period of time that I did, in defiance of many people's judgment, certainly in their assessment, and obviously at being a victim of substantial amounts of criticism from friends and family.
So people like you, JC Everson, was the co-founder of chess.com, Dennis Fong, Quake, Doom 2,
Yeah,
Quake 2 world champion. Those guys, like you guys all were a good influence on me, not just for being incredibly strong in the games you participate in, but also at some point realizing, okay, we're at a certain age and it's time for us to bring value to the world. Like just because you play games, like games have this bad reputation of you're wasting time, where it's like clearly some people do waste their time and waste their lives away. But if like you hear from this podcast how passionate Brian Weisman is about Magic the Gathering and the other games he's competing like Street Fighter 2. But this is just a tip of the iceberg. Like even my experiences with you is a tip of the iceberg, but I could feel the passion. And at some point, we're just like, okay, we've done our bit in gaming history as a competitor. It's time to spend time to build something of value. In your case, the item sales in Diablo 2 and then Path of Exile and then whatever else you have in the future. That's a transition that is not defended and not documented in the public that this podcast is supposed to enlighten.
Yeah, I'd certainly say in sort of modern times, as far as kind of giving back, I think that certainly my YouTube channel and my general continued advocacy for the game. I mean, I've done other YouTube videos and written some articles and stuff as well to sort of try to further it. But always, certainly, my highest priority right now, given the fact that we do sort of feel the weight of legacy at this point, and that we've kind of done a lot of the things that people sort of set out to do initially, as far as making a name for yourself, gaining renown and fame and recognition and so on. That, yeah, I think at this stage of my life, certainly it's just teaching, getting back to teaching. I mean, I love to teach. I love to introduce an entire generation, not of children, but of players who are kind of stepping out of the casual confines of what they've been doing.
Yeah.
And really taking the first steps into really beginning to understand how to play Magic correctly, and understanding the sort of underlying things that make Magic decks work, that you should be looking for while you play. The sort of, what I said a long time ago, the sort of goal-oriented thinking and pursuing how to play a game of Magic. People are often sending me commander decks that they've developed for critique. And one of the common things that I always say at first to them, and before I even start to talk, I say, well, can you summarize to me, what is this deck's game plan? What is it hoping to achieve in every game? And if you can't summarize what the deck's game plan is in a couple of sentences, you're not doing, it's not built correctly. You're not doing it right. And I think that that's one of the many things that I've been trying to impart to people as far as educating them to play Magic in a broader sense. It's hard to reach a broad audience, you know, particularly because I tend to be very verbose, and and I'm
In
not
here, I told you, unlimited time. So
yeah, and I'm not into nuance a lot either, and a lot of my points require a lot of framing and backstory and so on. And so I think that some people would probably lose patience with what I have to say. But the truth of the matter is that there really aren't very many things in life that are worth knowing that you can learn about quickly. Very, very few things, and certainly no skills that are worth having that don't take upwards of years and years of time to cultivate. All the things that really are worth, the skill sets that are worth having are that way because they're hard. You have to be willing to really, there's no substitute for putting in the time to really studying things in a way that other people may not have looked at them. You have to do that. I mean, because if you're not doing that, then you're just the same as everybody else who's just a dilettante, who's just dabbling at it. And it will never, ever achieve mastery skill at anything. Most people never achieve mastery skill at anything, which is unfortunate.
I agree, but like, you know, mastery is such a relative term too, because like my performances in 3 real-time games were top notch, but I didn't play perfect in any of them, even the, you know, deciding world championship games. Like I may have won it, but I know what mistakes I made. And same thing with athletes or I mean something like Magic or Hearthstone, you might be able to quantify that you played perfectly, but real-time games, there's always something you could do.
Right. There's just too many variables, and the decision trees are infinite, almost essentially infinite. I think when I'm talking about mastery skills, I'm not talking about it in a purely literal sense. This is more in the idea that you've just cultivated a skill that's, you know, in the 99.9th percentile, the kind of thing where the average person who does it will never ever be able to attain that degree of skill without a similar amount of dedication, regardless of talent or whatever. But
Right.
also the kind of thing that when people see it, the average casual player sees it, they're just utterly in awe, and they think that you do things that no person should ever reasonably be able to attain. It's that kind of degree of skill that you've cultivated in something. It doesn't mean that you win every championship event, and certainly, you know, the best, like the 10th best golfer in the world
Is
might
yeah.
win a major like once in his career. He's still the 10th best golfer in the world, right? He may never win a tournament, but he's so insanely good, and he's better than the millions and millions and millions of people who actively play golf. Clearly has mastery. Even the 100th best golfer, the 1,000th best golfer in the world, still has tremendous mastery ability, even though he's not going to ever be on the podium.
And
So
there's a
that's
lot
kind
of
of, you don't have to be
yeah.
the best. Just be great and just take it seriously. I'm going to turn my light real quick here.